Welcome to the Deep Dive Spirituality Conversations podcast. I'm your host, Brian Russell, and today it's my privilege to have as my guest Gena Thomas. Gena is a writer, a faith wrestler, a wife, and a mom. She's been married to Andrew for 12 years, and they have two elementary age children. She presently works as a program coordinator for World Relief. She's been, along with her husband, a missionary in Mexico. And she's been featured in her writing in NPR's Morning Edition, USA Today, Christianity Today. She's written several books, including one on missions work called A Smoldering Wick, Igniting Missions Work with Sustainable Practices, that applies international development practices to short-term missions. And back in 2019, she published her second book, Separated by the Border, a birth mother, a foster mother, and a migrant child's 3,000-mile journey. And in that story, she unpacks how she helped her Honduran foster daughter reunite with her family after being separated at the U.S. border. And then she's published Alisa and the Coronavirus, which was a children's book that she self-published back in April 2020. And she's working right now on a book about God's abundance. We have a really helpful and rich conversation about how to think about missions work, especially short-term missions practices, about justice work, and about how to better serve and to think about issues of immigration within our own country and how local churches can be part of the solution and to serve persons that have come into our communities from another country. Really enjoy this conversation, and without further ado, let's jump into the interview. Hi, Gena. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Can you share some key moments in your spiritual journey thus far that's kind of led you to the present and the career that you've had as a missionary, an author, and as an advocate for justice?
Yeah, so I grew up as a Christian, evangelical Christian. Never really know a day of my life without Christ. Which I consider quite lucky. And really it's been, it's been quite the journey, from, being in Bible club in high school to, Campus Crusade in college, to just kind of always, I think moving around as much as I did when I was younger, and having very large glasses. I think I've always been, had the perspective of, who are the people that feel left out? Who are the people that aren't being included right now? And just really have kind of honed a lot of my spiritual life around that, whether it was on purpose or just kind of happened. And so the call for justice, the feeling of really trying to understand what justice is and what it means, has really stemmed from feeling left out, to be honest, and knowing that other people feel left out too, and really trying to understand who God is and what God means to people who don't feel like they fit in. So, yeah.
Wow, that's I remember back in the 80s. I've worn glasses since I was 13, and I guess you probably had the same experience.
Yep.
The glasses get thinner and lighter every year you live, and
Yes.
I had these monsters. They used to slide down my nose all the time because I'm so nearsighted and everything. So I can resonate with that. So that's actually kind of cool. Could you just give your basic definition of when you say justice? Because a lot of people use that word. You're using it from a Christian perspective. So do you have like a hip pocket definition of what justice is?
Yeah, I think, a lot of my own understanding of justice came from really trying to study the Hebrew words, mishpat and tzedakah, and really trying to understand what does that mean for me? What does that mean for us? So mishpat being, giving what is due to someone else, and then tzedakah, a life of right relationship, and trying to really understand that you can't really give someone what is due to them if you don't have a relationship or a right relationship with them. That doesn't mean that you can't, give people what's due to them who are strangers. But what it does mean is that you have to have the right perspective of who that stranger is and their identity and their imago Dei that is innate in them, to really be able to do that, to do justice. and to understand what justice is for a specific situation. So yeah, that's what I mean when I say justice.
No, thank you. I think that's really clear. And as an Old Testament person, I love that you gave us a little Hebrew there too, so that you went right to the source for that. So that was awesome. So you started you and your husband. You mentioned right after were married, you went and served in Mexico as missionaries. What was that experience like? And specifically, what was it like being, and we'll come back to like what we can learn about short-term missions in a minute, but like, what was it like being a missionary as a young couple in your 20s and then moving back to the United States? And how did that change your experience of like what justice is maybe?
Yeah, that's such a great question. Living there in our 20s, and actually our son, our oldest, was born there too. So it was quite an experience for us. We were 7 months married. I like to tell people I don't recommend doing that. And the reason is because there was just, as you can imagine, moving to a different culture, a different language, there's just a lot of tension that is there and that you hold in trying to decipher through things like culture shock and what does it really mean to be a Christ follower that transcends cultures, because so much of, whether we see it when it's happening or not, but so much of our faith is determined by where we live and what language we speak and who we're around all the time. And so a lot of that was, just a reawakening. We specifically in Mexico, we serve two different, very distinct populations. So we had a coffee shop, and that ministered to the local community. And it also ministered to international rock climbers who came to the area to rock climb. And so we had this really interesting, juxtaposition of what faith looks like to different people from different cultures. We had people from all over the world come into the coffee shop. And we were able to have just some awesome conversations. Sometimes the conversations were nothing, and sometimes they went really deep. And then also, learning to be a part of a Mexican church and, do things that are sensitive to the Mexican culture, and not do things that maybe would do in the States that are perceived as totally fine in Christian culture that maybe aren't in Mexico. And so, it was a lot of just really digging into like, who are we? Like, what is our identity, and who is our identity in Christ, and how can that, follow us everywhere that we go, regardless of the culture around us. So when we moved back to the States, as most people experience, we had the lovely effect of reverse culture shock, and that I think it still happens. I think it's an ongoing thing. But it really did kind of reframe our own perspective of faith, and tried to, in a lot of ways showed us that what we thought was Christian maybe was actually just Christian culture, American Christian culture, and maybe I could even say white American Christian culture. And then I think we also learned to hold our hands open a lot more, whether that was with our faith and our theological ideas, or just, our general like living in daily life. When someone has a completely different perspective of what you should do. For example, with my son, when he was born, he needed to be wearing socks when it was 100 degrees outside. That's the Mexican culture. Like, you don't not have socks on your child. So, different things like that, where you just realize that, they might seem benign, but at the heart of it is just a recognition that maybe someone else's perspective is valid, whether it's whether it's about socks or whether it's about God. To like really think through, what is this person saying? Why are they saying it? Why have they come to this conclusion? And so I think that really challenged us when we moved back to the States. I would also say that having been there for 4.5 years under the leadership of our Mexican pastor, who we love dearly, really helped us to see a very different perspective of what pastoring can look like from someone who's not white. And I think that eventually that led us to finding a church that was not a white male pastor. And so trying to see things from different perspectives and realize that most of the books we read on theology are white males, different things like this, that I think a lot of people are going through a lot of that deconstruction now. I think for us, it was during that time, and it was because of our experience in Mexico that really kind of layered the filters of culture in ways that we hadn't seen before.
And just to follow up on that, I was going to ask you about what you learned about spirituality, but I think you kind of hit a couple of those things. So how do you actually help, again, different, depending on where you live? Like I live in Orlando. So when I moved down here, grew up in Ohio, and obviously had experiences this in our school. My school that I went to in elementary school was integrated when I was very young. And so, I was always used to both, being around various different types of white people from different parts of Europe. That was very much immigrant culture up in Northeast Ohio when I was growing up, and then around African Americans. So I knew some of the experiences, but it wasn't until I literally moved to Florida that I got to meet really the biggest you got to even use the right language because it's non-English speaking group in the United States, would be persons that speak Spanish from all various countries from the countries that are around the United States, and wasn't even aware of these wonderful cultures. Like I'm married now to a woman from Puerto Rico. When I was growing up, I didn't even know that was part of the United States, which is kind of that was an embarrassing confession I made to my wife when early on, which made her laugh and stuff. But but being in Orlando, it's been natural just to make friends from all over the world, and I know that that's massively enhanced my ability to teach, to be a better Christian, or just a better human being. But I always wonder what would have happened to me if I would have stayed in, the area where I grew up, say Northeast Ohio, and and you lived in different parts of the country where you have more homogeneity. That's the wrong. I think it's the right word. Or just you don't really get to maybe you only know one type of culture that's slightly different than yours. So what would you say to somebody that has never experienced the breadth of humanity, and what might they be missing, and how do you help people to say, maybe I need to read some different authors? Do you have any advice on that?
Yeah, it can certainly be tricky, especially these days, right?
Yeah.
In all the different ways that things are politicized. I think, when we think about the Bible and who Jesus was and how he had represented in his small group with him so many different political views, different cultural backgrounds, different socioeconomic backgrounds. I think that he exemplifies to us what it means to have diverse group of people around us. And sometimes, that might be in age, that might be in theological beliefs, that might be, in different ways that diversity can happen. I do think that it's really helpful now, as easy as it is to get our hands on books or audiobooks, my personal favorite, or podcasts, or even through social media, to really hear what others are saying that maybe we wouldn't normally listen to, or aren't typically part of our our homogenous circles that typically we flock to. So there's all kinds of resources for people to reach out to. And I think that's really what then opens the door for us to say, hey, like, let me take a look at my own life and, see the diversity or lack of diversity that I have in my friendships, in my relationships, in, who I read and who I'm listening to, and really trying to understand again with that cultural piece that what is it about God? Like, what is the Bible actually saying that transcends culture? I think those things are seen much more when we are around diverse people, where, it's not normal for this family to go to church every Sunday. Maybe they go to church on Wednesdays, and what we think and automatically associate in our heads with what it means to be a Christian then gets questioned, and those questions turn into a deeper faith. And so, yeah, I'm not sure that I answered your question exactly. It certainly depends on who you're talking to, but hopefully, I think as Christians, we can really, we can look throughout all of the Bible and see the different cultures that interact with each other. And then that stems into a much deeper faith of who Christ is.
Yeah. And just, I think that's a great answer. And could you, obviously mention politics, and obviously we can go down that whole road, but at some level, folks tend to be afraid of people that are different from them, and whether that has evolutionary roots, or it's just flat out sin, or combinations of all those things. That's often a bridge that you have to cross, because we always think, well, you've experienced people going on short-term mission trips, and we'll say more about that, but it's always like, oh, I'm going to go help the other. So how do you actually, or is it even possible to help a person who's, again, mostly used to people that are just like themselves? Even it can even be economics. A lot of people, even if they have a diverse friendships, they still have the same economic class, basically. So how do you actually help persons to literally break down boundaries and to embrace another? Not so much that the other has to become like us, but that I'm willing to literally, take the walls down and, and go and have dinner, not at my table, but go and share somebody else's table where I'm the person that's different. I mean, do you have any tips on that? Have you found ways that help folks to get a little bit more comfort with breaking down the us and them kind of dynamic?
Yeah, I think probably the first step is listening, and like learning how to actively listen to other people. Again, we're in an age where any kind of debate is just like we're just all throwing things at each other. Nobody's actually sitting and listening. And so if someone has an issue with you or with your viewpoint, and you actually sit down and listen and try to understand the motivation behind that issue, it's often that we come to recognize, well, I actually have that same need or that same human desire or whatever it is, and I can relate on that level. I do think theologically it helps us when we constantly remind ourselves that we're all made in the image of God.
That's good.
That it really just brings everything back to, am I treating my fellow human being as I want to be treated, right? Am I honoring the Imago Dei in this person by, listening or acting the way that I'm acting around them? And I think that I do think it takes time. I loved your example of like going to someone else's house and eating the food that they create for you, because it is easy, to bring your own food, whether that's actual real food or we're talking theoretically here, like to bring your own food to that group and then be like, I'm friends with this person, when that's not actually the case. And so I do think it takes a lot of humility, but man, we have the best example of humility there ever was as Christians. And so I don't know that we have much of an excuse to not really do some of that deep, difficult work that, in all reality, I feel like our society, and however you want to phrase that, I do think that America has its own empirical ways, like its empire ways of doing things. And so as empire, we are taught like, you alone matter, your own opinions matter only to whatever degree that might be, and you don't need other people. And so to learn how to like be interdependent with others is really something that the church kind of offers to show us. Some do it a lot better than others, but that's really what this is about, is that mutuality where I need you and you need me, and together we can build the kingdom better. But if I only ever need myself, or I'm only ever the one who feeds other people, then eventually I'm lost. And I see that unfortunately all too often these days.
And I want to ask you a couple of questions about immigration. And obviously you have a really compelling story in your book, Separated by the Border: A Birth Mother, a Foster Mother, a Migrant Child's 3,000-mile journey, where you really write up just a powerful, true story that you experienced firsthand. But so from your own experience with a foster child, and then just living in Mexico, now living in the United States, and just kind of seeing the immigration conversation, or lack thereof, I guess would be the immigration argument that we tend to have as Americans. What would you say are some common assumptions that Christians, and we'll just talk about Christians now, have about immigration, immigrants, refugees, that are potentially misguided?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that it's an easy choice to come to the States, that it's land of the free, home of the brave, who doesn't want to come here kind of thing. And I think that assumption can get us in a lot of trouble, because both in the situation that I talk about in my book, and also in a lot of different situations that I know personally from immigrant friends of mine. The choice to come to the States is usually one that is taken very seriously. It's not the best option, but it is an option. And unfortunately, a lot of people, a lot of the push factors that are happening in Central America, a lot of people are making that decision based on life. They are seeking life. And I think that if, those of us who are Christians and call ourselves pro-life, we have to recognize that this is a pro-life issue. And rather than seeing it as a scarcity through our scarcity mindset, because in regards to the situation that happened with my foster daughter and her biological mother, it really was an issue of trying to save a family member's life to come here, and that really, that if that could no longer be, misinformation that we have, if we could all agree on that, I think that we would get a lot further as Christians working towards immigration reform than we currently are.
So what would be some strategies? And again, you're an expert on, you're working on international development, and you're working, can I say who you're going to work for? Is that?
I think it's okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So you work for, a group called World Relief. So you have some real expertise in this particular area. What are some strategies that local churches can develop that would actually help immigrants and refugees that are hopefully probably in proximity to the people that are listening to the podcast, that folks that have come to the United States? So what are some strategies that you see work that truly serve, glorify Jesus, and help probably help the churches to grow more spiritually, but most profoundly help the folks that are actually coming into our country?
Yeah, I think it kind of goes back to some of what we were already saying, right? So, so building relationships with immigrant communities. In most areas, there's immigrant churches that are meeting. So for church leaders and pastors to actually branch out and reach out to those communities and say, hey, what are you doing? How can we help? How can we support you? What issues are you facing specifically to your region? And how can we kind of get behind it and help with that? And I think, as a writer, I always go back to language. I think one of the most profound things that we can begin to do, generally across the board, is to watch our language that we use with immigrants. I talk about this quite a bit in the book, but there are certain things that are often said, whether by other Christians, by legal counsel, by organizations, by politicians, that do not honor the Imago Dei in immigrants. And I think that, again, if we are pro-life and we are pro that Imago Dei, that we do all we can to honor that. So watching the language that we use, not using dehumanizing language towards immigrants, and then again that active listening of, if you do know someone, actively listen to their story, and maybe they don't want to tell it, and that's okay if they don't, but if they do, to really pay attention to what it is, what motivates them to come to the States, and what issues are they currently facing because of it. There's a lot of xenophobia happening right now, and any ways that we can help decrease that and the effects that it has, which is often, long-term effects that it can have on people and their mental health, in addition to physical health issues, I think is really important to be aware of. There's plenty of organizations that are doing, a lot of really great immigrant and refugee work. And I have a lot of resources on my website for that. But I think specifically preaching from the pulpit about immigration it's surprising how few people do that. How few churches actually do that. And then like in sharing with congregations and with, Bible study groups or small groups, like what does the Bible actually say about immigration? Because it says a lot, and we are to welcome the stranger and the foreigner, right? But we do a lot of the opposite. So
what would you say if you were going to pick a couple of passages that would be texts that maybe should be preached more than they are? What are a couple of your go-to, you think, most helpful passages that would help people that are listening, if they haven't thought deeply about this, to be more biblically informed about immigration and how to treat persons that are from, that aren't local to the context that you're living.
Yeah. Well, I think that we actually preach on those passages. We just don't focus on the immigration aspect of them. So, the story of Ruth, the story of Abraham, like there's tons of stories. Daniel, who's exiled, right? There's tons of stories in the Old Testament that talk about immigrants. I mean, really, or refugees. Even Jesus, right? Like his family was refugees in the land that they were in, and so we just don't focus on that aspect. And I'm not really sure why we don't. I mean, obviously, the more we talk, the more we have these conversations, the more we can see that aspect. And that's a beautiful thing about Scripture, is that we see different aspects of it as we mature and as we grow and as we diversify our the people who are influencing us. But I do think that there's a lot to be said about immigration, and it's already there, right? We're already talking about it. So let's just, take the step further and see exactly where it is that we can really pour into that and see what it's saying, to our present day about how we're viewing immigration. So I was just reading about Esther and her story, and had never really thought about the aspect of her being in exile where she was, and what that culturally required of her to become Persian, right?
Mm-hmm.
To make other people see her as Persian, the assimilation that comes from that, the injustice that comes from assimilation, that's required of her to make it to a place of importance in the culture that she was in. So all of those things are there. We got to pay more attention.
No, I think that's really helpful, and it's such a great word. I know one of the hardest things when I teach, I teach the book of Exodus quite a bit. That was what my dissertation was on, and I think one of the hardest pieces is that I find when students get confronted. Obviously, everybody gets hung up on Pharaoh's hard heart and such. But I think the deeper issue there is even to process the violence in a book like that is, especially for if you've grown up in the United States, it's to realize that the United States would be Egypt essentially, and you have to read it, completely flip it, or you end up using power inappropriately as a Christian.
That's right.
And I think, but that's once you kind of see it, you can see it. But most of us, it's almost like a fish in water. We're not realizing we're in that water of empire, and that, to me, and as soon as you see that, all the stories, like you just, I was expecting you to say a couple of texts, but it just changes the way you read the whole scriptures. Even Paul talking about being citizens of heaven and being a citizen, he's subverting that whole idea of Roman citizenship, like in Philippians, for example. And so it's really good. So thanks for that reminder, Gena.
Yeah, that's so good, Brian. Thanks for sharing that. So good.
Well, you're welcome. So I appreciate that. So talk a little bit about, you said, I think a couple of things. You said you love language, and you've also used the phrase active listening a couple of times. And so, without listing out words that we shouldn't say, because I don't really want to even say words that would be hurtful. How does a good intentioned, kind Christian person who's just unaware, how do you, we're going to do what's called microaggressions, and I don't always think people do those things on purpose. So let's just assume I'm a reasonably decent, kind person, and I want to love my neighbor, but I don't know the words to use or not to use. So how do you help people who maybe have stepped accidentally, because it's a person who wouldn't want to if they did. How do you help people to avoid the wrong language when you're talking to somebody who's different from yourself, or assumptions? Like I was mentioning my stepdaughter when she was in North Carolina. Everybody thought she was Mexican automatically just because she's Latin. So it had to be a Mexican. So how do we avoid those kind of like microaggressions?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I think whenever you're wondering, should I say this? Should I not? Err on the side of not.
Yeah, it's good.
And then on top of that, kind of again, just kind of going back to relationships. Do you know someone well enough to ask that question and to say, hey, should I call you African American or should I call you Black? What do you prefer? because, some people prefer Latinx, some people prefer Latina. So, right. So you ask those questions and you figure out what people prefer, and don't assume that everyone has the same preference. I think that's one of the big things is, you and I, Brian, we're both white, we're both American, but we have a lot of different preferences. And to assume that we have the same preferences is dehumanizing. Right. And so I think that's another thing. I think, I've been thinking about Job's friends quite a bit lately, and how, they're so fascinating to me. And I feel like I could totally be one of them, in the story, and how they do this very large, it almost is performance of fasting for a long time prior to actually even having a conversation with Job about stuff. They're fasting and they are sad, they're lamenting about what's happened, and yet they turn around and have this conversation with him, that is completely off. Right, their perspective of who God is not who Job is realizing God is through this process. And I think that oftentimes, our listening, quote unquote, is more like that performance listening rather than really empathizing with what the person is going through and understanding, where they're coming from and what they're doing, or what's motivating their current actions. And so I think obviously the Bible gives us all kinds of examples of what to do and what not to do. But I do think that that we have to watch that our listening is not performance, and that we actually truly are trying to empathize, trying to understand. And to a certain degree, I will never know what my Black brother is going through right now, because I'm never going to be in that position. And like you were talking about with power, right? Like I have always had more power in my whiteness. So I have to listen as much as I can and empathize as much as I can. And, when you have a certain relationship with a person, you can say the wrong thing and say, I'm so sorry I said the wrong thing, right? I mean, I think we can apologize anytime, but to have those relationships where you can learn and grow and say, I should have said this here and I said this instead, and I'm really sorry. Sometimes we don't see that. Sometimes it's a brother or sister who has to remind us, hey, this is not okay to say. It's okay in your white culture to say it. It's not okay in our culture to say it. So I think all of those things are just really important as we grow, but also just to not be afraid to make mistakes, right? I mean, it's okay. It's okay to make mistakes, and we're not going to use the right language every single time. And unfortunately, I think the pendulum swing is, say everything perfectly. But that's not human either, right? That's dehumanizing too, because we are all humans and we all do make mistakes. So if we have, the right people around us who give us the grace when we make mistakes and tell us in truth that we're making a mistake, then we can become better people.
Yeah, thanks for that reminder too, especially at the end, because sometimes it, like you said, it's either like we almost set up a standard, and this is would be a false standard too, is that we have to be perfect. And some folks balk against that and then don't even try. And then you just, right. It's so in a sense, the riskiest thing is just to be willing to be a human, show up with the best of intentions, try to be like, I like to use the phrase ambassador of God's abundance, because that's what I want to be in my life. But but obviously I fail at that.
For sure.
Right. And so, but it doesn't mean I'm not going to keep trying to show up.
Right.
And, and also love, I'm going to think more what you just said too, after we're done about Job's friends, because they're easy to dump on. But you just reminded me that these guys, they were trying. They don't say anything for like a week or something. Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
So they sort of do spiritual practices and then still goof it up anyway, and which is kind of an interest. That's so thank you for that. Was a good insight. Well, let me shift the conversation towards I guess it was your earliest book, A Smoldering Wick, Igniting Missions Work with Sustainable Practices. That you and so, as a person, you and your husband been back in the States for a season now, and obviously, and when you were there, you would, I guess, receive persons on short-term mission trips. So what did you learn? Like, what are key insights, key mistakes, and also positives of groups that do these cross-cultural, really short-term experiences? Sometimes we think, I'm going to go save those poor souls in some other country,
Right.
but that doesn't. In most people, that doesn't really happen. So, like,
Right.
what did you learn about that process, and what advice do you have for churches that legitimately want to help other persons in other countries?
Yeah, yeah, that's great. So I yeah, this is a loaded question.
That's your whole book, right?
It is, yeah. For a while there, I kind of had thought that I was just going to be like, no, don't ever send a short-term missions trip again. And I need to confess that there are days when I think that, when I hear the bad stories, right?
Yeah.
However, I had a wonderful example of a really great team that did that active listening, paid attention to what they were doing, did not try to create their own schedule, but joined in the schedule that was already happening on the ground. Didn't try to control, the project specifics, but really partnered with a lot of it. And I think that, one of my favorite tools that I created in the book is called a typology of participation, which actually was not created specifically for short-term missions, but for economics. Professor in Sussex, I think, had created it for economics, but I kind of adapted it for short-term missions. And it's been really helpful for a lot of people, I think. So if anybody wants to see it, they can email you and I'll be able to send it to you. But it really talks through, like, what is your participation level here? Is this manipulative participation, or is this actually participatory in what you're doing? Are you, moving people into being their own, decision makers, and or are you just, again, performing, right? Is this performance participation? Because a lot of short-term missions turns into, especially coming from the West, turns into a checkbox, right? A list of things that we've done, and we've gone there and we've done this, and now we're come back and now we're telling you everything that we've done. But that's not, again, going back to justice, that's not what justice is. So when we're trying to build a life of right relationship between the sending organization and the receiving organization, then it requires a lot more. And those requirements can be challenging. They can, make us relook at everything. But those are really more what partnership is actually about. And I think a lot of people say that they're partnering, but that's not actually what's happening on the ground. So the book is an attempt to help people actually partner. So, yeah.
And what would be an example of one of the best partnerships that you actually personally witnessed?
Yeah, great question. So, one of the examples, like, let me just give this example of, Goofus and Gallant, if anybody knows highlights from back in the day. So the one team that calls and says, "Hey, we want to plan a missions trip with you guys. We've got 10 people who are coming down. They're all really good at painting houses. So that's what we're going to do. So you just let us know whose house you want us to paint, and we'll paint them." Right. So that's an example of a group that is under the guise of participation, because this other group is going to tell them, "Hey, these are the people who need houses painted." But the other missions trip that comes down, I think it was the leaders that came down first, had a conversation with our local pastor and said, "What is it that you're already working on? What are you doing as a church? What projects do you have going? And what is your plan for those projects? How can we help you create, more effort and more movement towards the projects that you already have on your plan, that are already a part of your dream and the goals that God has given you in this church?" So they came down, had that conversation, came back to the States, got a group of people together, worked stuff out so that the scheduling was not a giant interruption to, the Mexican church's regular schedule. So sometimes what would happen is that people would want to come for Vacation Bible School in June, but school was still going through June in Mexico.
Mm.
So, for those who wanted to do VBS, well, everyone's still in school. So, you're literally taking teachers away from the classroom, or, interpreters away from the classroom to do what you want to get done so that you can check this off the list, versus actually doing what helps and what makes sense for the culture and the community, as they currently are and currently moving. So that particular church had come down probably 5 or 6 times in a row, just helping in that way. And it really was beautiful. And I remember our Pastor David, saying, if any other church had asked me, because at one point they had asked about financials, like what they were working on. And he said, if any other church had asked me, I would not show them this. They don't deserve to see this, but this church has invested in us and done, the hard work. And so they really are coming alongside of us to work on this. And I'll tell you, in northern Mexico, that's hard to find, because there's a lot of, because it's so close to the border of the US, there's been a lot of damage done by US churches saying that they'll do something or pretending to partner or not actually partnering. So it was a really big testament to the church here in North Carolina that was doing that.
Yeah, thank you for that example. That seems actually attainable, what you just said, because sometimes you get the idea that, wow, there's this huge problem, but just simply, like, I think it's what you've been saying the whole time. You actually got to listen, pay attention, and make sure you're actually helping, and not and not actually drawing off the resources of the folks that you think you're trying to help. So thank you for that really good example. Well, I want to be safe for the time. I really appreciate you coming on. So, just a few last kind of questions. What's next for you? Where do you sense that God is leading you over these next few years? And maybe is there a book that maybe you're kind of afraid to write that you'd love to, but at the same time you'd actually love to write?
Yeah, so I'm currently working on a book right now about God's abundance, which is cool that you say that about what you had said earlier. Ambassadors for God's abundance. I'm going to be thinking about that for a while. So this book is I actually started writing it in the midst of the pandemic, and which is kind of ironic and funny if you think about it, because we're all, as a globe, we're all like, what's scarce, what's not. We're missing masks, we're missing PPE. Like, what all can we do? But the concept of the God of abundance has been just really, really hitting me over and over again. And I think the biggest thing that I'm seeing with that is that there's a huge difference between the framework, which again, we could kind of talk about empire mentality, the framework that says that there's prosperity and there's scarcity, and there's only those two things. And then the framework of God's abundance, that's a completely different worldview, and works off of different things. And what sometimes looks like prosperity or sometimes looks like scarcity can actually be a part of God's abundance. While, scarcity and prosperity, what I say in the book is that they're really the two sides of the same coin, because they say, if you're prosperous, you have X, and so therefore you are this, right? Your identity is matched to what you have. And again, with scarcity, your identity is matched to what you don't have. And so it's always just those two things, and that's always what we're looking at. But when you have an abundance mentality, then you can see that that maybe what looks like, 5 loaves, let's just use that, can actually turn into something huge. But it's how we perceive it, right? It's not necessarily based on what's actually there, but our worldview of what is there and what could be. And so, when we lived in Mexico, when we came back to the States, we had resumes that were pretty blank in comparison to other people at our age, in that 4.5, 5 year span. We did not work on any kind of IRA. We didn't have any savings for retirement, no savings really in general. In fact, we ended up living on welfare for a while. And so, but I can look back at that time and see that it was God's abundance. That just hit me. Just because there are these moments where I remember distinctly one time going to the grocery store again and using my WIC vouchers. And prior to going to the grocery store, I just thought, Lord, I know that you have a feast, you have a feast for us. And then I went to the grocery store, got the stuff, brought it back, and I was like, just because it came from government hands doesn't mean it's not a feast, right? So, yeah, that hit me. To just recognize that God's abundance can even be in the midst of our deepest scarcity, that he's always there,
No, that's good. And thanks for even sharing that. And just, I will honor that transparency with just a quick story you might like to. I don't know if I've actually said this on the podcast. I've done this in sermons, but like, I remember when my divorce happened, and it was just, I mean, gosh, that was just so devastating to me. And one of the things that helped me bounce back, it was cost so much money and stuff. And so I was like, just flat out broke. I was trying to take care of my kids, and I was just terrified. And I just remember, I mean, I couldn't even, I was watching how much gas I put in my car. And I remember I'd gotten a check for something, and I'm like, I'm not even driving to the bank because I'm not sure if I want to spend the gas to go to the bank. And so I'm riding my bike, and I'd been working on a sermon on exactly what you had just talked about. I was writing a sermon on John 6, where Jesus has his feeding of the I forget if it's 5,000 in John 6 or not, but it's that similar story. And in the John version of the feeding of the crowd is a little different from the other ones, because it has this great verse that it says, everybody ate as much as they wanted.
Yes.
And that's an abundance passage. And again, I had this, so it was actually a mystical experience, but I needed it. God was so good to me at the worst time. I had some of the most powerful encounters with the Lord during that, but I was just riding my bike down this road. And I remember I actually had to stop my bike. And I felt like, again, I don't know if really was God speaking or not, and it doesn't matter ultimately, but I just had this picture where God literally said, Brian, I'm a God of abundance. And there's enough for you, and don't ever forget that. And it was like, wow, okay. And here I am, I'm riding my bike because I can't buy gas. Yeah. And I'm like, cool. And so I just want to honor that space that you just went into, because and that's a transformational mindset. So I learned about abundance when I literally was in scarcity at that point in my life. And it's been, and that was such a, that's one of the, again, you don't want to say being in a bad spot is a blessing, but that was one of the blessings of being in a bad spot for me. And that's where I got that whole ambassador of abundance stuff. That all came out of me in this time when I was at one of the most scared points of my life, and where I wasn't sure if I was going to make it out the other side. And so just thank you for that moment you just shared with us, Gena. So I just want to honor that space that you just said. But so having said that, how do you ground yourself then, so that you can practice abundance? I mean, what are your typical spiritual habits that help you to show up and be the woman that God created you to be, most of the time, at least, if not all the time?
Yeah. Yeah. This is such a good question. I would say that it's part of my weakness right now, just with so much transformation happening in our family and transitions. So I used to do this thing where I would do like a prayer walk every day. And hopefully I'm going to be at a place, in the next couple of weeks where I can get back into that. And just, I don't know if you've heard of the app Pray As You Go, but it's, but it's been a really good kind of spiritual practice for me to be on that. I'm a 5 on the Enneagram. So I sometimes will walk with my rosary. I'm not Catholic, but my family is. And so I have a rosary from a family member of mine that handed down. So I'll walk with that and, just kind of move my hands around the beads so that I can actually stay focused on the praying. And then I would say that another thing is just, anytime we're talking about measuring, right? Anytime we talk about success or measurements of success, I feel like I'm always just like, okay, but what does that actually mean? Like, how do we actually define that right now? How is it being defined to me, whether this is work related or not? How is that being defined? And am I actually trying to live up to that goal, or do I have a different goal? Because I think so often it's our definitions of success that play such a key role in keeping us in that prosperity scarcity mindset. Is success, climbing up the corporate ladder, or is success being a whole human being right now? Is success, going to therapy? Is success, taking a walk right now and walking away from a difficult situation that, I might say something that I shouldn't say. So trying to re-gauge on a regular basis what success looks like, and with a big picture, a little picture. And then I would say also just in the mornings, I try really hard to take some time to read, if I can. It doesn't always happen. But again, with school starting and hopefully everyone's going back in person, dear God, please,
Yeah.
then we can get back into some of that stuff. So, yeah.
No, yeah, thank you. And I love that question that you even framed out about how to get definitions for success. And so I think it's such a great question to ask ourselves, and how do we really live that out? And that's such a powerful question when we learn how to ask that. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
And thanks for the reminder. I mean, yeah, the rosary, a lot of people think that's Catholic, but those are just those are such helpful tools. And I think,
yeah.
and I'm wondering, it's like, I think you're the second person who's mentioned a rosary to me recently. So I have to think about, well, if it happens one more time, I know I'm supposed to get one, I guess. But, but that's really cool. So thanks for sharing that too. Cause I think that it's just so helpful. I always like to ask people that, because we cookie cutter spiritual formation too often.
Yeah.
And it's so important for people to hear different examples of what works. Not that we want to mimic everything that that Eugene are doing, but maybe I should try that if I'm stuck, and maybe I'd find something that helps. So thank you for that.
Right. Yeah.
And now the impossible question for a person who's as well educated and well read as you are, which is, besides the scriptures, what would you say are 2 or 3 books that have really helped to shape you spiritually?
Yeah. Oh, it's just such a great question. There's so many. I'm trying to narrow it down to a couple. I think Prophetic Lament by Sung Chan Ra is probably one of the most defining for me, especially in writing my book Separated by the Border, because I actually personally went through a lot of lament during that season and didn't really know what to do with it. A lot of times we're not discipled into what it means to lament and how to lament well. So that has really been specifically helpful for me. And then I think anything by Brueggemann, I'm a big Brueggemann fan, but Journey to the Common Good was probably one of my most favorites. And that kind of, going along the lines of justice, kind of moving towards shalom. What is shalom but a justice-filled community, right? And so that journey to the common good is just a really beautiful picture to me of reframing a lot. And I think those 2 specifically. I mean, there's a bazillion others, but yeah, I'll leave it at those 2 for now.
Oh, thank you for those two suggestions. I actually haven't read either of those, so I'm gonna have to add those to my list. So I appreciate the new books. And then just last question: if people want to find out more from you, where would be the best place to connect with your work? I'll put all the links to your books and stuff up on the notes. But what would be a great place for folks to reach out and find a little bit more about your work, Gena?
Yeah, so my website is probably the best. It's Gena, Gena Thomas, THOMAS.com. And then I'm on some of the socials, not all the socials, but Twitter is my favorite. So it's Gena, GENALR Thomas. So yeah, hopefully we can connect with people there.
All right. Well, thank you, Gena, for being on the show. And I really appreciate and just want to honor you showing up and asking your questions and, being as transparent you were and really helpful to the audience. So thank you for being the person that God created you and called you to be.
Thanks so much, Brian. It means a lot.
And everybody who's listened all the way to the end, we're so grateful to have you along. And until next time, live by faith, be known by love, and be voices of hope in the world. Amen.
Amen.
So much for listening to this week's episode of the Deep Dive Spirituality Conversations podcast. If you found this episode helpful, would you share it with your friends or with your social media network? And I would be truly grateful if you would leave a review wherever you found this, and that will help other people to find interviews like this. If you're interested in any of the resources that were mentioned, they're all in the show notes. And I would also encourage you, if you're interested, to check out my latest book, Centering Prayer, Sitting Quietly in God's Presence Can Change Your Life. It's now available via Paraclete Press. You can check it out on Amazon. That's also in the show notes. If you would be interested in learning a little more about centering prayer, you can sign up for my email, and I'll send you a newsletter. I'm not a spammer. Send something out every once in a while about centering prayer that might help you to develop a deeper practice. You can go to centeringprayerbook.com and sign up for those updates. If you have any comments or questions about the show or suggestions for guests, email me directly, deepdivespirituality gmail.com. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next week on the next episode.